So, Amanda, tell me about how you got into the mental health field.
Well, I guess I got into the mental health field through being a patient initially. I became extremely unwell, first of all physically, and just the trauma of that really brought out a big depression, which kind of, to cut it short, it went kind of from depression. I was variously diagnosed with you go through a great long process of diagnosis. You sit in front of one psychiatrist and they say one thing and another one says another thing, but it went from bipolar to borderline personality disorder, and I think we're settled on borderline personality disorder now.
So you've talked about being diagnosed as depressed and now as having borderline personality disorder. How important is that process of diagnosis for you? For the professionals, I think it's quite important, but does it make a difference to you?
Yes and no. The personality disorder, because it's such a horrible title, actually I had to get over that. It sent me into a spiral of quite self-harming behaviour, just trying to get over that initial shock of that label. But I'm the type of person that needs to research and read about things and look things up. And so if I hadn't had that diagnosis and that label, I couldn't have gone and learned about it. And I did start reading. The first time I read a book about borderline personality disorder, I remember getting quite indignant that actually I was in the pages, kind of, oh, hold on, that is, oh, I have, oh, that's part of my diagnosis. So from that point of view, I think it's important. In the other way, of course, it's important is that you can meet other people and who've got the same diagnosis, and we don't feel quite so alone. Because if you don't know anybody else who's got the same condition as you, whatever that condition might be, it can feel quite scary and alienating. So,
can you say something more about that, what you call self-help, really? You've been involved in self-help groups. What role do those play in the lives of people with mental health issues?
Positive and negative, actually. The positive things, some of the things that I've said, that support to each other, learning, talking things out with people who just really get it. But the other side of that is that if you're not careful, that becomes all there is in your world. And they're the people you socialise with, and with mental health issues, you quickly find out who your friends are, and on the whole, you lose a lot of friends, and social life disappears. So if you're not careful, that can be your social life, and you end up just being around people who are sick and talking about being sick all the time. So it's not being around the sick so much, but it's talking constantly about your problems and your issues, and it gets very seductive, and you get into a pattern of thinking that actually isn't very helpful.
So you need a self-help group which moves people forward rather than sort of reinforcing their sort of patient, victim, illness type identity.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Now, you've got a diagnosis. From a biomedical model, the doctor would say, oh, we've got a drug for that. So presumably you've been prescribed various psychiatric medications over time. Does that help? Does that cure? Does that fix it?
Well, you would probably be quite shocked if you saw how many meds I take. I take 21 different meds every day. I said you'd be shocked. Some of those are for physical pain as well. They're not all, but a good deal of them are. Now, do I think they're helping? Short answer is I don't know. And actually, I've been on quite a lot of them for a number of years, and I suspect that my body has got a bit used to them, and that actually now I've got much better coping skills, and I've got much higher self-esteem, and all of those other things that being a peer tutor gives me. I am looking at actually, can I reduce those meds? So actually starting in a couple of weeks' time, I'll be going and talking to my doctor about actually, look, here are all the meds I'm on, what can we reduce? Because unless you try, you actually don't know if they're working, and the ones that are, I'll go back up and hopefully I'll be able to come off a few.
And we've talked before, I take regular heavy doses of painkillers, and what I found when I was changing drugs, I suddenly realised I was actually dependent on those drugs,
Yeah.
which was a scary feeling that, you know, you're a junkie essentially. And so I had to sort of titrate down before I could get off it. Otherwise I was left with a screaming heebie-jeebies. So,
And that's how I suspect it would be for me, yes. I won't come straight. I have seen someone come straight off them fairly recently, and she couldn't understand why she was feeling quite as ill. And that's not advisable. So I will be titrating down because, yes, essentially I am a junkie, as you say.
so you'll have encountered the medical model of psychiatry, but also now we have the recovery model. What does that recovery model mean for you?
Well, recovery is one of those interesting words when you're talking about people with long-term conditions, because when I first heard it, for instance, in the medical field, and I understood that, you know, it was a cure, but I'm not going to be cured, and I'm always going to have symptoms and mental health symptoms. So then you have to look at, well, what does personal recovery mean? And for me, it's a way of living as fulfilling a life as I possibly can with the ongoing symptoms that I have.
I've read that one of the things about recovery, which is very important to service users, is this notion of hope.
Yes, and hope is really hard to get. And I was talking about that today, actually, with a group. And we were talking about, you know, does empowerment come first, or identity, or hope? Because all of these things are interlinked. And hope is one of those things that is forward-looking. So you can't be looking back. A lot of the times when you've got depression, or, you know, you're sitting at home and you're thinking about the past and the things that you regret, and I was missing a lot of things in my old life. But if you've got hope, it's forward-looking and you're thinking about the future. So it really is important for recovery, but really difficult to get.
So with this recovery model and this co-production, you know, you could say this is quite risky. You know, we let people, as it were, run their own lives and have a say in things. Suddenly they might go a bit crazy and hurt themselves or somebody else. How would you answer that criticism?
What, the lunatics running the asylum? It has got a bit like that. Well, I think there's risk in everything that we do. And obviously we have to think about risk all the time. When you're talking to me about risk, the risky behaviour that I'm worried about is self-harm or suicide. So that's what I judge myself on. How risky am I feeling today, or how risky is this situation that I'm going to put myself in terms of those two things? In order to grow, you have to accept a certain amount of risk, and we do in all of our lives. You think of your kind of comfort zone, and, you know, unless you get out of that comfort zone into the learning zone, if you like, you're not going to grow and you're going to stay stuck. So we have to accept a certain amount of risk. There are things that I could do to minimise my risk. So my favourite one was when I was going through a time when I was taking overdoses quite regularly, which was obviously not good. So I got a whole ball of sellotape and wrapped the key of my medicine cupboard up in the entire roll, because by the time I'd got to that key, that impulsive behaviour had actually calmed down, and I'd had time to think, actually, no, I can deal with this another way.
And obviously some people have advanced directives, so when they start behaving, when their symptoms return, or they start behaving in an unwell way, other people are empowered to intervene and to take action, or to ensure that they don't damage their own interests. But that still maintains the control of the individual, which is what's at the heart of the recovery model.
That's right, because actually, you know, recovery is all about doing something for yourself. So what we urge when we're talking to people, students, is to say, you know, what have you done for yourself first before you then call on the professional help? Because often there's more that we can do than we think we can, and that keeps us empowered and in the driving seat.
Now, you said just now that you'd been talking to some people today. I think you were training some peer tutors. So this is really interesting. What is a peer tutor in the mental health field?
Well, this is pretty new. It's been around just a few years. And basically that the Trust has set up a recovery college. And they're looking at instead of a therapeutic model, but actually going into more of an education model. So when we say college, we really do mean that when you come into the room, you're students. And a peer tutor, as I am, is somebody who's got lived experience and is facilitating workshops. So some of the workshops I've written and I facilitate those ones, and other ones I've learned from other people.
So what sort of sessions or workshops would be involved?
Well, today, for instance, I was on week 1 of a 6-week course called Wellness Planning, which looks at a whole range of coping skills, really, and strategies. And because the lovely thing about having someone with lived experience is I can say, well, I tried this and, you know, this worked for me. And other people say, well, I've tried X, Y, Z. And we all learn from each other in the room, and it's just lovely. Someone
might say, look, Amanda, you've got a particular individual experience. How can you tell somebody in general what works? You know what works for you. You might not know what works for them.
No, which is I work with a colleague. So this is where my colleague comes in, and I work with somebody in mental health services. So today I was working with a social worker, and she's a trained mental health worker. So she's got the learned experience. So between us, you know, you've got the lived and the learned experience. It's called co-production, and it's the way a lot of the recovery services are going, which is lovely. It gives kind of service users a voice, really. And I think people tend to take it from me more than they will take it from a professional. You know, if I look someone in the eye and say, I get it, you know, they can't dismiss that.
And the people you're training are people who've had mental health issues, mental health problems, but they're also other staff as well, aren't they?
Yeah, staff are in the room, carers as well are in the room, and service users, and we're all learning together. What we ask staff to do is take their badges off at the door and come in as a student with everybody else. Most of the time, eventually, you can identify which the staff members, although I did have somebody sidle up to me after a 4-week course and say, is she a staff member or not? Because we've been wondering, which is exactly how it is lovely and it should be. And because, you know, she's not saying, I know it all and I'm just going to talk to you. She's really listening and taking it on board and just learning with the rest of us.
What happens when staff themselves have lived experience of having had mental distress at some time or other? I mean, something like 1/3 of us will do in our lifetime, so quite a few staff probably do.
Yes, and I think actually sometimes that's what draws them to the profession. Either they've got it themselves or they know someone, maybe they've cared for someone, and I think that is often what draws people into this field. Well, before, I was going to say in the olden days, but not that long ago, staff would be discouraged from sharing any of their own personal things. But now actually we're breaking that and saying, you know what, if by you sharing something, it helps the person who is in front of you, then why wouldn't you share that? You know, why would you keep it a secret? So some staff, especially those who have been there for a long time, are finding that a bit of a challenge because that's new, where before they would have been disciplined for, you know, telling someone that they had suffered depression or had bipolar or schizophrenia. But of course, the reality is we've got staff with all of those conditions. And what a role model to be able to say, I've got this condition, but look, I'm still working. You know, you can still be a doctor or a psychologist or a social worker, even with those conditions, because I think for the vast majority of us, once we get sick, we kind of become professional patients and think that that's it and that's all that life is going to be.
That's very interesting because my work's about disability and I work with a lot of people who have chronic long-term conditions, and I'm interested in how they can be included in society, get jobs, partners, live in the community, be successful like anybody else. And it seems to me that that's where mental health is at, that there's symptom control, but there's also getting our life back and having a meaningful life with a good quality of life.
Yes.
And that's what we should be concentrating on.
Yes, and of course there's a lot of stigma about disability and a lot about mental health as well. So traditionally, we have hidden indoors and not gone out, and it does rob you of an awful lot. My diagnosis of personality disorder, you know, when I first heard that term, to be told your personality is disordered is an awful thing to be told. And actually, I lost an awful lot of confidence and self-esteem because I started thinking, are people looking at me and thinking, gosh, she's crazy, and, you know, what is she talking about? And so you do hide, and it is difficult. But actually, the only way I think that we can combat stigma is to kind of stand up and say, I've got it, and I don't have two heads.